In the early 20th century, the world changed forever. Nations rose in pride, armies marched into chaos, and an entire generation was scarred by fire and steel. This is the story of how humanity's deadliest war began and how it reshaped our future. Welcome to History of Conflicts, where every battle tells a story and every story reveals the cost of war. Think of a single morning when the world changed. Not overnight, not with a warning, but through a chain of small human decisions. A telegram in a Vienna office, a parade beneath a young officer's window, a train ticket purchased in Belgrade. One gunshot in a Sarajevo street would become the spark. But the spark did not fall from the sky. It fell into a landscape already soaked in fuel, wired with alliances, and humming with new weapons. Today, we retrace the steps that took Europe and the world from uneasy peace to total war. This is the story of empires, secret treaties, new technologies, and human choices that turned a diplomatic crisis into a global catastrophe. This is the dawn of World War I. Picture Europe at the turn of the 20th century. Cities growing, empires glittering, steamships crossing oceans. It was an age of invention and optimism. Railways stitched nations together, telephones connected voices across distances, and industrial wealth filled great capitals with pride. On the surface, progress seemed unstoppable. But underneath that confidence, tension pulsed. Old empires creaked under the strain of diversity. The Austro-Hungarian Empire governed many peoples who dreamed of independence. The Ottoman Empire struggled to hold its territories together. Russia ruled over countless ethnic groups that longed for their own destinies. Meanwhile, Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, was flexing its power. Britain still ruled the seas, but saw rivals rising. France remembered humiliation and hungered for revenge. Nationalism was sweeping the continent. Millions began to identify more with their ethnic or linguistic groups than with their monarchs. Patriotism blended with paranoia. Europe looked stable, but it was a comfort built on a fault line. To understand why war erupted in 1914, we must understand those pressures. Empires feared collapse. Small nations wanted recognition. And the great powers watched one another's every move with suspicion, each believing it must stay ahead or be destroyed. Alliances turned Europe into a network of dominoes. Each country whispered promises in back rooms, pledging to defend each other if attacked. The intention was peace through strength, but it created the opposite, an environment where one spark could set the entire system alight. By the early 1900s, two major camps had formed. On one side stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire. On the other, France, Russia, and Britain drew closer together in what was known as the Triple Entente. Each alliance promised protection, but also obligation. A conflict involving one partner risked dragging in them all. On paper, alliances were designed to deter aggression. In reality, they made peace fragile. If one nation acted rashly, its friends would be compelled to follow. A border dispute could snowball into a continental war. Leaders believed these webs of promises would keep the peace because no one would dare attack such united strength. But they underestimated pride, fear, and the complexity of human decisions. When the crisis came, these same alliances would transform hesitation into momentum and momentum into war. Now imagine neighbors competing not over fences, but battleships. That was Europe in the years leading up to 1914. Industrial power had become military power, and every nation wanted to prove its strength. Germany's rise terrified Britain. The British Empire had ruled the seas for centuries, but Germany's new navy was growing fast. Massive dreadnought battleships symbolized prestige and security. Britain responded by building more, and an arms race began. On land, armies expanded. New rifles, machine guns, and artillery changed the face of warfare. Railways meant that troops could be moved quickly across vast distances. Telegraphs carried orders at lightning speed. It was a revolution in logistics and technology, but it also shortened the distance between diplomacy and disaster. Germany, feeling encircled by rivals, invested heavily in its military planning. France, still haunted by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, vowed to recover lost pride and lost provinces. Russia tried to modernize its massive but unwieldy forces. Austria-Hungary watched its southern borders nervously, while Italy and the Ottoman Empire sought to protect what influence they still had. The result was an arms race where the goalposts kept moving. Each advance by one country triggered another by its rivals. Nations prepared for a war they insisted would never come, yet their very preparations made it more likely. Technology promised speed, power, and security. Instead, it created tension, fear, and a ticking clock. If Europe was a powder keg, the Balkans were the spark. The region had long been a crossroads of empires and religions, a mosaic of Slavs, Turks, Greeks, Albanians, and others, each with competing claims to land and identity. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, its territories became prizes in a regional struggle. New nations like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece fought wars to expand their borders. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 reshaped the region, leaving behind bitterness and revenge. Serbia emerged stronger and more ambitious, dreaming of uniting all Slavic peoples under its leadership. But that dream clashed directly with Austria-Hungary, whose empire included millions of Slavs who wanted independence. To Austria-Hungary's leaders, Serbia was a threat to internal stability, a small, defiant neighbor stirring rebellion within their own borders. To Russia, Serbia was a kindred nation to protect. Each saw the other's involvement in the region as provocation. The Balkans became the stage where great powers tested their influence. Each crisis seemed to pass, but none truly ended. Resentment and fear hardened. Behind every negotiation was a readiness for force. And it was here, amid overlapping ambitions and old grudges, that the event which would ignite the world took place. A murder in the city of Sarajevo that turned diplomacy into mobilization and alliances into weapons. It was a sunny morning in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Crowds lined the streets to see Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife, Sophie. The Archduke was heir to an empire already showing cracks beneath its surface. His visit to Bosnia was meant to display unity and authority. But unseen in the crowd were young men who had come to send a very different message. They were Serbian nationalists, members of a group that believed violence could free the South Slavs from foreign rule. The first attack failed. A bomb thrown at the Archduke's car exploded behind it, injuring bystanders, but not its target. The convoy continued. Hours later, by tragic coincidence, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn down a side street. Standing there by chance was one of the conspirators, Gavrilo Princip. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck Franz Ferdinand. The other hit Sophie. Within moments, both were dying. It was a small act of violence in a world used to political assassinations. Yet the ripples it sent through Europe were unlike anything seen before. The shots in Sarajevo echoed across borders, across alliances, across the fragile peace that had held for decades. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was stunned and enraged. National mourning turned quickly to blame. And beneath the sorrow was a cold calculation: how to use this tragedy to crush Serbia's growing influence once and for all. What followed was not inevitable. It was a series of choices made by men who thought they were in control of events. In Vienna, officials drafted an ultimatum to Serbia, one so harsh that it was almost impossible to accept in full. They believed Serbia needed to be punished to preserve imperial authority. They also believed they had Germany's support no matter what. Berlin gave what became known as the blank check, assuring Austria-Hungary that it would stand by them even if their actions led to war with Russia. Confident in this backing, Austria delivered the ultimatum on July 23, 1914. Serbia accepted most of the demands, but asked for clarification on a few points that threatened its sovereignty. It was a conciliatory reply, but not enough for Vienna. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The dominoes began to fall. Russia, bound by ethnic and political ties to Serbia, ordered partial mobilization to deter Austria. Germany, seeing Russian mobilization as a threat, prepared its own forces and demanded that Russia stop. When Russia did not, Germany declared war. France, allied with Russia, began mobilizing in turn. When German troops crossed into neutral Belgium to attack France, Britain declared war on Germany to honor its treaty with Belgium and prevent a single power from dominating the continent. Within a week, what had started as a local conflict between two nations became a war engulfing nearly all of Europe. Diplomacy was replaced by mobilization orders. Generals took the stage where diplomats had once stood. The July crisis showed how fragile peace had become. Pride, fear, and misunderstanding pushed nations past the point of no return. Each government told its people that it was defending itself. Each believed that hesitation meant weakness. And so, one by one, they marched into catastrophe. For decades, military planners had prepared for this moment. They had mapped out precise timetables, train schedules, and troop movements down to the hour. Once the gears of mobilization began to turn, they could not easily stop. Germany's plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to strike France quickly through Belgium before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. It was a gamble that depended on speed and surprise. Russia's plan was slower, relying on its vast manpower, but vulnerable to delay. France's plan focused on reclaiming territory lost to Germany decades earlier. The problem was that these plans left little room for diplomacy. Mobilization was not just a military decision, it was an act of war. Once a nation began moving its armies, its neighbors felt compelled to do the same. Every move looked like aggression. Trains thundered across Europe, carrying soldiers who believed they would be home by Christmas. Crowds cheered them on, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. Newspapers promised quick victories. Few imagined the scale of the disaster that awaited. What no one could yet see was that industrial technology had changed the very nature of war. Modern rifles, machine guns, and heavy artillery would make the old tactics of heroic charges and open battlefields obsolete. The world was about to learn that progress could be both powerful and merciless. Once the engines of war started, there was no stopping them. By August 1914, Europe was ablaze. Austria-Hungary bombarded Serbia. Germany invaded Belgium. France and Russia mobilized in response. Britain entered the war to defend Belgium's neutrality and maintain the balance of power. In a matter of days, millions of soldiers were on the move. Battle plans that had existed only on paper were now realities of steel and blood. The first battles revealed just how unprepared the old world was for the new kind of war. In Belgium, German forces met unexpected resistance. Civilians fled as towns burned. Propaganda painted both sides as monsters, fueling hatred and fear. In France, the early clashes of the frontiers were brutal and costly. Each army believed victory was near, but by September, it was clear that speed and strategy were no longer enough. The Battle of the Marne halted Germany's advance into France, but at a terrible price. Soldiers on both sides dug in to hold their ground, and the war of movement slowed to a crawl. Across the world, colonies and dominions of the great empires were drawn in. Troops from India, Africa, Canada, and Australia joined the fight, often for causes far from their own homelands. The war was already global. In the early weeks, many believed it would be short. The phrase "home by Christmas" echoed in cities and villages. But the war that had begun in confidence was about to descend into endurance, despair, and mechanized slaughter. When the armies stopped moving, they began to dig. The trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, hundreds of miles of mud, barbed wire, and misery. Between them lay no man's land, a desolate strip where any movement could mean death. The machine gun defined this new kind of warfare. A single gun crew could mow down waves of attacking soldiers in seconds. Artillery shells rained down day and night, churning the earth into craters. Poison gas drifted across the lines, burning lungs and blinding eyes. Commanders struggled to adapt. The strategies of old Europe, gallant charges, cavalry advances, glory in motion, were useless here. The cost of a few yards of ground was measured in thousands of lives. At Verdun, at the Somme, and at countless lesser-known places, men fought not for victory but for survival. Technology that had once promised progress now delivered death more efficiently than ever before. Airplanes began to appear in the sky, first as scouts, then as weapons. Tanks rumbled onto the battlefield, slow and clumsy, but signaling a new era of mechanized warfare. The soldiers lived like ghosts in the mud. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Letters home became lifelines. The sound of distant shells replaced silence as the background music of their existence. The trenches became symbols of the modern age, the triumph of industrial power and the collapse of human optimism. The Great War was more than a clash of empires. It was a lesson written in blood and sacrifice. If you want to uncover more moments that defined our world, subscribe to History of Conflicts and join us as we explore the untold stories behind the world's most pivotal battles. Like, share, and subscribe, because history should never be forgotten.